Stop chasing happiness and start finding your purpose. Carl Jung observed that the harder a person chases the feeling of happiness, the faster it slips away from them, like a bird that startles the moment a hand reaches for it, and that the people who stopped chasing that feeling and asked instead what their life was actually for, found something steadier following behind them without being chased at all. Here is where Jung would want us to slow down. In Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, he wrote that the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being, not to arrange for a pleasant temperature, not to feel good on schedule, but to kindle a light. And Jung would stop you right there and say, "Do you see it?" He did not say the purpose of existence is to feel happy. He said to kindle a light in the darkness, which means the darkness is assumed. The darkness is the given condition. And the light is not a mood you catch, it is a fire you tend. So if you have spent years chasing a feeling and wondering why it keeps going out, it may be because a feeling was never the thing you were supposed to be tending in the first place. So let me say this plainly before we go further. I stop chasing the feeling of happiness like a shadow that runs the moment I reach for it. I start asking instead what my life is actually for. I make the unconscious conscious. Say it with me. I stop chasing the feeling of happiness like a shadow that runs. The moment I reach for it, I start asking instead what my life is actually for. I make the unconscious conscious. Again, I stop chasing the feeling of happiness like a shadow that runs. The moment I reach for it, I start asking instead what my life is actually for. I make the unconscious conscious. And if you would like tomorrow's teaching to find you the way this one did, this is a good moment to subscribe. Quietly, no fuss, just so the next fire gets lit for you too. Before we go on, if something in you just went a little quiet while I said that, type the words "face it" in the comments, not as a performance, just as a small private seal between you and yourself, that you are done chasing and ready to look. The first key is that happiness is a mood and purpose is a direction, and you cannot steer a life by a mood. Think about your own last Tuesday. You woke up and reached for your phone before your feet touched the floor. You scrolled for a lift. You found a small one. It lasted about as long as the scrolling did. You bought a coffee that cost more than it should have because the first sip felt like a tiny holiday. By 10 in the morning, that feeling was gone too. And somewhere around 3 in the afternoon, you caught yourself staring at a screen thinking, "Is this it?" That is not a character flaw. That is simply what happens when you build a day out of moods instead of meaning. And here is the part most people never stop to notice. A mood cannot be steered because a mood was never yours to steer. It arrives the way weather arrives, uninvited, on its own schedule, and it leaves the same way. So a person who plans a whole life around catching good moods is a person trying to build a house on top of clouds. The house will fall every single time. Not because the person failed, but because clouds were never load-bearing to begin with. Think of the vacation you saved for and finally took. The one you told yourself would finally make you feel settled, and it was lovely for a few days. And then you came home, and within a week the old flatness had quietly moved back in, like it had simply been waiting outside for you to unpack. That is not because the vacation was wrong. It is because a feeling can never be stored. It can only be visited. Now widen the picture a little, because this is not only about vacations and coffee. Think of the friend who changed cities twice in 5 years, chasing a feeling they could not quite name. New apartment, new job, new faces. And each time the first month felt like proof they had finally found it. And each time by month 4 the same old quiet dissatisfaction had followed them across every border, like luggage that refuses to stay lost. They kept blaming the city, when the thing missing was never a location at all. It was a direction. A mood vane simply spins to face whatever wind happens to be blowing that hour. While a compass points the same way in a storm as it does on a still morning. And that difference, spinning versus pointing, is the entire difference between a person governed by feeling and a person governed by purpose. Purpose is different from mood. Purpose does not visit. Purpose stays. It is not the sunny day. It is the field the weather happens on. The field is there in the rain and in the drought, and on the one perfect afternoon in June, none of the weather changes whether the field exists. A garden that only gets watered when it happens to rain will wither in a dry season. But a garden with someone tending it, checking the soil, carrying the bucket even on the days nothing feels rewarding about it, keeps growing regardless of what the sky decides to do. So the first shift is small, but it changes everything downstream. Stop asking a day to feel good. Start asking what the day was for. Ask it of the Tuesday. Ask it of the vacation. Ask it even of the flat grey hour at 3 in the afternoon. Because a day with a reason underneath it can hold a bad mood without breaking. While a day built only on mood collapses the second the mood does, I tend the fire. I do not chase the weather. The second key is that some pain is legitimate and some pain is a substitute, and confusing the two is exactly how a person ends up successful and empty at the same time. Jung wrote in his collected works, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering," and he meant something very specific by that. There is a pain that belongs to you, the pain of growing, the pain of an honest reckoning with what your life actually wants from you. And there is a pain that is manufactured because the real pain was refused. Imagine a man who has already won every game he set out to play. The promotion, the house, the marriage that looks good from the outside. And he comes home one evening and cannot say why he feels like he is standing in an empty room even while surrounded by everything he worked for. He is not lacking achievement. He is lacking the one confrontation he has been avoiding his whole life, which is the honest question of what all of it was actually for. So instead, his body invents smaller pains to distract from the larger one, a restlessness he cannot name, an irritability that surprises even him, a hollow feeling that no purchase and no compliment can touch. That is sterile suffering, suffering with no seed in it, and it exists specifically to keep him from the fertile suffering, the real question, which is harder, but which actually grows something. Jung was not cruel about this. He simply refused to let anyone mistake the substitute for the real thing. I do not run from the real question just because it is heavier than the fake ones. The third key is that meaning does not arrive as a grand revelation. It arrives in the least of things. And this is where Jung's own words are the most useful sentence I can give you today. In Modern Man, in Search of a Soul, he wrote, "The least of things with a meaning is worth more in life than the greatest of things without it." Sit with that phrase for a moment. The least of things. Not the biggest achievement, not the most impressive title, the least thing. And Jung meant this almost literally. He was not being poetic for the sake of comfort. He was describing how the psyche actually receives significance. It does not arrive in a lightning bolt on a mountaintop. It arrives folded inside something so small you could miss it entirely if you were rushing past it towards something bigger. And this is precisely why the search for a big meaning so often fails. You go looking for the mountaintop and step right over the doorstep where the thing was actually waiting. So let us walk through an ordinary day and see where meaning actually lives. 6 in the morning. You make coffee for someone else before you make it for yourself. That is a least thing. But if you attach meaning to it, it becomes an act of care rather than a chore. 7 in the morning. You notice the light coming through the kitchen window, and you actually notice it instead of walking past it. That is a least thing too. And it costs you nothing but 2 seconds of attention. 9 in the morning. You sit through a meeting that bores you. That is a least thing. But if you know it funds a life you are building on purpose rather than by accident, it is no longer wasted time. 1 in the afternoon, you call a parent you have been putting off calling. That is a least thing. But it is also the whole of what will matter in 20 years. 3 in the afternoon, you catch yourself about to snap at a coworker, and you choose the slower, kinder sentence instead. Nobody will ever know you made that choice. But you will. And that is a least thing carrying an enormous weight. 5 in the evening, you sit with a child's homework or a friend's bad day instead of the show you wanted to watch. That is a least thing. And it is also, quietly, the largest thing in the room. Now notice what all of these have in common. None of them announce themselves. None of them arrive wearing a sign that says, "Pay attention to me. This matters." They slip past disguised as chores and interruptions and small inconveniences. Which means the person waiting for meaning to announce itself will wait their whole life. Because meaning does not knock loudly. It sits quietly inside the coffee cup, and the phone call, and the bitten-back sharp word. And you either notice it there, or you miss it entirely and keep searching the horizon for something grander. Now imagine a woman who spent years waiting for her real life to begin. She kept postponing meaning until some future arrival, a promotion, a move, a relationship that would finally make the days feel worth having. And every ordinary evening in between felt to her like a waiting room, something to endure rather than something to inhabit. She would come home and think, "This is not it yet," and file the whole day away as unimportant. The phone call to her sister, the walk with the dog, the ordinary dinner made from what was in the fridge, all of it filed under "not yet." And years passed this way. The promotion came and did not fill the room she thought it would fill. And one evening, tired, and a little disappointed in the promotion itself, she found herself sitting on the floor, with her dog's head in her lap, doing nothing remarkable at all, and she noticed, almost by accident, that this moment felt more like her actual life than anything on the calendar had felt in years. Jung would say she had not stumbled onto a bigger meaning. At last, she had simply stopped overlooking the small one that had been sitting there the entire time, waiting for her to stop rushing past it toward the future. I stop overlooking the least things while waiting for the greatest ones. The fourth key is that this emptiness you feel is not a personal failing. It is closer to an epidemic. Jung, working through his own case files, noted the senselessness and the aimlessness of their lives as the actual complaint behind complaint after complaint, not one dramatic wound, but a low grey fog of purposelessness that had settled over people who by every outward measure were doing fine. He came to call it something close to the general neurosis of our age, meaning it was not confined to the hospital or the clinic. It had leaked into ordinary living rooms, into people with steady jobs and full calendars, and nothing wrong with them on paper. Picture an ordinary street at 6 in the evening, every house lit from the inside, every kitchen window glowing the same warm yellow, and behind each one of those windows, a family finishing dinner, a couple watching the news, someone scrolling quietly on a couch, and if you could somehow walk that street and see straight through the walls into the actual felt life behind each window, you would find the same grey weather sitting in house after house, some spoken, because each person assumes the fog belongs only to them. The man in the third house thinks he alone is ungrateful for a life that looks so full. The woman in the seventh thinks something private and broken in her is the reason the evenings feel hollow. Neither one says a word to the other, and so the fog gets mistaken, house after house, for a personal defect instead of what it actually is, a shared condition, wearing 1,000 separate faces. That is the epidemic Jung was pointing to, not a fever that announces itself, but a quiet consensus of silence, everyone suffering the same hunger, and everyone certain they are the only one. And if that describes a season of your own life, you are not broken and you are not alone in it. You are simply living inside the same weather Jung was describing decades ago. The mistake is to treat this fog like a mood disorder to be cheered out of, when it is closer to a starvation not of pleasure, but of significance. And pleasure cannot feed a starvation it was never built to feed. You can offer a starving hunger, for meaning an endless parade of comforts, a new show, a new purchase, a new distraction lined up for the evening, and the hunger will take none of it in, because you cannot eat your way out of a question. That is why chasing happiness harder, when you feel this fog, only tires you out faster. It is the wrong food for the actual hunger. I name the fog for what it is. Hunger for meaning, not a shortage of fun. Now if that landed somewhere honest in you, this channel exists to keep handing you these keys. one careful teaching at a time. Subscribing simply means the next one finds you when you need it. The fifth key is where we turn this whole teaching back onto you, because it is easy to nod along about crowds and broadcasts, and much harder to ask, quietly, whether I am describing your actual Tuesday. First, consider this. In a broadcast in 1959, near the end of his life, Jung said plainly, "Man cannot stand a meaningless life." He was an old man by then. He had sat across from thousands of patients over decades, and that sentence was not a slogan, it was a diagnosis, delivered with the calm of someone who had watched the pattern repeat itself too many times to doubt it. So ask yourself honestly, when you feel that flat, grey afternoon feeling, the one no purchase touches and no scroll relieves, is it possible that what you are actually starving for is not more comfort, but more significance? Not a better mood, but a better reason. And notice how quickly the mind resists that question. Notice how much easier it is to blame the weather, or the job, or the traffic, or the season, than to sit for even a moment with the harder possibility that the hunger is structural rather than circumstantial, that it would follow you into a bigger house, and a better job, and a calmer year, just as faithfully as it follows you now. Second, consider the shape of your own chasing. You have probably already tried the obvious remedies. A new hobby, taken up with real enthusiasm, and quietly abandoned by spring. A change of scenery that felt like rescue for exactly as long as the suitcase stayed packed. A purchase that promised to lift the fog and did, for an evening, and then did not. And somewhere in the pattern of trying and failing and trying again, you likely arrived at a private and unspoken verdict. That something is wrong with you specifically, that other people seem to manage happiness and you simply do not have the knack for it. Jung would ask you to consider a kinder and stranger possibility than that. That nothing is wrong with you at all, that you were simply feeding the wrong hunger with the wrong food, offering pleasure to an appetite that only meaning was ever built to answer. And no amount of pleasure, however well chosen, however expensive, or however clever, will fill a hole shaped like purpose. You cannot eat your way out of a question. Third, picture an ordinary evening that is not so different from one of yours. Imagine a woman who works hard and is, by any outside measure, doing well. She comes home, and there is a particular 10 minutes, right after the door closes, and before the television or the phone or the wine glass gets picked up, when the flat feeling arrives on schedule, quiet, grey, familiar, and for years her habit has been to reach immediately for whatever is nearest, because the feeling itself seems unbearable to simply stand inside, so she never actually meets it, she only ever outruns it, night after night. And the outrunning becomes so automatic that she stops noticing she is doing it at all. She would tell you, if you asked, that she is simply tired, but Jung would gently suggest that tiredness is often the alias meaninglessness travels under, because meaninglessness is embarrassing to name out loud, while tiredness is not. And now picture the same scene from a different angle. A man 3 streets over, who does the same thing at 11 at night, lying in bed with the phone lighting his face blue in the dark, thumb moving without any real hunger behind it, not looking for anything in particular, just refusing to lie still long enough for the quiet to say what it wants to say. And if you have ever wondered why the phone feels almost impossible to put down at exactly that hour, it may not be the phone that is powerful, it may be the silence underneath it that you are working so hard to keep covered. Fourth, consider what it would actually cost her, and him, and you, to stop outrunning it. Because the familiar fog, however grey, is at least known. You have lived inside it long enough to almost mistake it for your personality. But the real question underneath it, the one about what your life is actually for, is unfamiliar and a little frightening, because it might demand something of you. It might ask you to leave a comfortable arrangement, or finally have a conversation you have been circling for years, or admit that a version of success you chased so hard for was never actually yours to want in the first place. Jung never promised that facing this would be comfortable. He promised only that it was fertile, that unlike the fog, it would actually grow something, And this is the part worth sitting with a little longer, because a fog asks nothing of you. It simply sits there, grey and undemanding, which is exactly why so many people would rather live inside it for years than risk the one honest question that might actually clear it. Fifth, and this is the quiet turn underneath the turn, notice that the fog never actually argues with you. It never insists. It only waits, patiently, the way water waits at the bottom of a hill for you to finally stop climbing away from it. And every distraction you reach for, the scrolling, the purchase, the noise, is really just another small climb away from that same low waiting place. Which means the fog is not your enemy pursuing you. It is closer to a question sitting patiently at the bottom of the hill, willing to wait as long as you keep circling the top. So here is the exercise, and it is small on purpose. Take one evening this week, and in that same 10-minute window where the flat feeling usually arrives, do not reach for the nearest distraction. Instead, sit with it for 90 seconds, only 90 seconds, and ask it one honest question. What are you actually asking me to pay attention to? You do not need the answer immediately. Jung trusted that the psyche answers in its own time and its own language, in a dream, in a sudden clarity while washing a dish, in a conversation weeks later that suddenly makes sense. Your task tonight is not to force the answer. Your task is only to stop drowning out the question with the next distraction. And here is the part I want you to actually hear underneath all of this. The fog you have been living inside is not proof that your life lacks meaning. It is proof that a meaning is trying to reach you and has not yet been let in. The flatness is not the absence of purpose. It is purpose knocking in a language you have not yet learned to translate. I stop drowning out the knocking with the next distraction. The sixth key is the gentlest one, and it is this. Purpose is never found once and kept forever. It is tended, the way a fire is tended, which means some days it burns low, and some days it flares. And neither of those is a failure. It simply means you are alive inside a real thing, rather than performing a finished one. Think of someone who keeps an old lantern by the back door through a long winter. Every evening before dark they check the oil, trim the wick, wipe the glass clean of soot. And most nights this takes less than a minute, and nobody watching would call it meaningful. But on the one night the power fails, and the road outside turns black, that lantern is the only reason anyone gets home safely. The lantern did not become important on the night of the storm. It was already important on every ordinary evening, when it was quietly kept ready. Purpose works the same way. You do not discover it once in a blaze, and then carry it fully lit for the rest of your life. You keep it, evening after evening, in small, unremarkable acts of attention. And notice how this differs from the chasing we started with tonight. Chasing asks the fire to stay bright without tending. Chasing wants the lantern lit without oil and without a trimmed wick. And when the flame gutters, chasing concludes the lantern was faulty, or that you were faulty, when really the only thing missing was the boring evening habit of care. Think of a man who takes up something meaningful with real fire in October. A course, a discipline, a return to an old craft. And by January the fire has gone quiet, and he tells himself the whole thing was a false start, when in truth, he only stopped trimming the wick. He mistook a low flame for a dead one. And a low flame only ever asks for the small evening care again, not a whole new lantern. On the nights when your own dark comes, and it will come, that quiet keeping is what you find still burning. Jung lived this himself. He did not arrive at his sense of purpose as a young man and coast on it. He rebuilt it in his late 30s, after a collapse of his own certainties, and he kept tending it into old age, right up to that broadcast where an old man told the world plainly that a meaningless life is unbearable. So if you started this feeling behind, feeling like everyone else had already found their reason and you were still searching, hear this clearly: the search itself, done honestly, is the tending. You are not behind, you are simply still gathering the wood. And if today the flame in you feels low, almost out, that is not the end of the story. A low flame is not a dead one. It only means the wick wants trimming, and the glass wants wiping, and the small evening care wants doing again. You do not need a new life to feel purposeful again. You need the same small, honest evening you have been skipping, the phone call, the 2 seconds at the window, the slower, kinder sentence, done again tonight, and again tomorrow. Stop waiting to feel finished before you call your life purposeful. The finishing was never the point. The keeping was, stop chasing the feeling that keeps running from you, and start tending the small, honest fire that is actually yours. I tend what is mine, instead of chasing what was never mine to catch. Here is the whole picture. Happiness is weather, and purpose is ground. Some pain is sterile, and some pain is fertile, and only one of them grows anything, meaning hides inside the least of things rather than the grandest ones. The fog you feel is not a personal failing, but a hunger with a name. The flatness in you is purpose knocking rather than purpose absent. And the fire is never finished, only tended, 6 keys, but really one recognition, that you were never broken for failing to catch happiness. You were simply reaching for the wrong thing with the right hands. So I stop chasing the feeling of happiness, like a shadow that runs the moment I reach for it. I start asking instead what my life is actually for. I make the unconscious conscious. Once more, I stop chasing the feeling of happiness like a shadow that runs the moment I reach for it. I start asking instead what my life is actually for. I make the unconscious conscious. And if the fog finds you again tonight, let it knock a little longer before you reach for the next distraction. It may only be purpose, finally learning your name.